Well, hello. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Really, I appreciate folks' interest in what I have to share in terms of presentations that I give. And in this one, particularly, I have an interest. I've been studying this particular topic for quite a long time. And I just think it's such an important one, particularly given that so many people are just becoming interested in their family history. A few of you may have been doing this for quite a few years, maybe a couple of decades or more. But so many other people are coming into this brand new, wanting to understand more about their family genealogy, but more importantly, the history. And I think that's the critical part. This genealogy research is more than just about attaching names and putting those down in a chart. It's really also understanding the context of the history in which people lived. And I'm really pleased to provide this particular presentation because, it's very common for people when they start thinking about New Mexico history and New Mexico genealogy. It's very easy for folks to be thinking New Mexico, Spain, and making that jump. And maybe you've heard this as well, that people say, well, family's been here for hundreds of years. We lived isolated. New Mexico Spanish has been spoken this way in northern New Mexico since the 1500s, as if there's this unbroken chain that has occurred in isolation since 1598. Well, I'm here to help you see this a bit differently in terms of our roots. And what are our roots? It's not simply New Mexico, Spain. People have heard me say this before, but nobody ever got off the boat in New Mexico. There's a lot of places in between and many, many years in between the time that people did come from Spain to the New World, to the Spanish Americas, before they even came to New Mexico. And that's what I want to share with you today. So my name is José Antonio Esquibel, and as you heard here from the introduction, I've been doing this genealogical research for quite a number of years, since the late 80s, and publishing since 1992. And in fact, my first publications that I submitted were to the New Mexico genealogist. So I've been associated with this organization since that time. So it's a real pleasure to still be here doing this kind of research, continuing to research and write. I do have more essays coming out in anthologies in the next year. I will continue to submit articles to various journals. I continue to do research, and I have a whole bunch of material that I'm hoping to get to, particularly once I get to the point that I'm retired. But in this particular piece, I really want to help people understand where really some of the cultural beginnings for New Mexico are, and this important period of 1693 to 1697 for really providing that foundation for the mixing of people that then creates our genealogy, as well as the development of what we refer to as Nuevo Mexicano culture. So let's move through this and walk through what we're looking at here. Just a little bit of background, though, first. I think it's important for people to understand a little bit about the 17th century, the 1600s in New Mexico, and the population. There's a bit of a misunderstanding where people are just kind of wondering, well, how many people were there in New Mexico that were of Spanish origin, or that were considered Spanish citizens, surrounded by thousands and thousands of Pueblo Indians, as well as another thousands of Apache Indians or Navajo Indians or other nomadic tribes. But back in 1598, 1600, there were about 248 men that came as soldiers to New Mexico, some of them with families, with wives. By 1601, there was only about 217 of them left. People were starting to leave. They were disenchanted with New Mexico. There was difficulty because Oñate did not bring enough food. People were having to rely on the Indians for food. And we see that by 1602, quite a number of folks have left, and there's only about 68 men, about half of them with families, left. And then even by 1609, really most people have given up. Oñate has resigned and gone back down south, but about 50 soldiers and some Franciscan friars petitioned the king to retain New Mexico, and these 50 soldiers become the foundation for New Mexican Spanish society in the 1600s. And I'll give you more about those names in a minute, because many of us are descendant of these people. By 1617, there's only about 48 soldier vecinos with families. 1620, there's an accounting for about 50 of them. In 1626, we have another 50, about 250 individuals, plus about 1,000 mestizos and Indians living in Santa Fe. My sense is that most of that is probably Indians living in Santa Fe. 1638, we're told there's another, again, 50 soldados, about 200 individuals. So you can see the population did not really grow when it comes to the Spanish vecinos during this time period. By 1601, few more families, but mainly these are the children now having families of the original folks, so that those 50. By 1679, we have 170 Spaniards and castas of different backgrounds, coyotes, mestizos, you name it, that could bear arms, including about 43 soldiers that came from Mexico City to help with defense in New Mexico. Most of those soldiers didn't stay. A couple of them did, but most did not. So that at the time of August 1680, which in our world is a critical date, is the year of and the month of the Pueblo Indian Uprising, there are about 1,400 Spanish citizens living in New Mexico, and approximately 13,000 Pueblo Indians. So again, the population isn't large. Many of you have probably been to an event, a concert or a ball game or somewhere where, fireworks, where there's been a lot more than 1,400 people. So if you can just think about that small number, that was the total Spanish population in New Mexico by around the time of 1680. After that time period, in terms of the folks who fled northern New Mexico and went to El Paso, we can only account for about 1,247 individuals. Again, not a very big gene pool, not a very big group of people. If you want to know more about that history in terms of the people, where they lived, some really nice charts and tables about the families and the people, I highly recommend this book by Eleanor M. Barrett. I was really privileged to work with her and provide some of my research findings with her to help her understand where people resided, who were the families that stayed, and what that population looked like in the different parts of New Mexico. So it's a book that's still available in print, and highly recommend it. If you don't want to purchase it, you can always request it through interlibrary loan, so you have a chance to read it and collect some of that information. Now, this Pueblo Indian Uprising, a few things, because this event really shapes and changes the course of history of New Mexico and the development of Nuevo Mexicano culture. But a few things to know about this uprising. First of all, in the 1600s, there really were longer periods of conciliation and cooperation than there were of conflict. I know that sometimes people get very emotional about this, thinking about the role of the Spanish and the Pueblo Indians, but folks, there was a lot of cooperation, and all it takes is a little bit of looking at some of the original records, which some of them are being transcribed now and made available online. They may not be translated, but some are. But as you read through this, you'll see that, yeah, there was some conflict, people not getting along. For the most part, the Pueblo Indian leaders saw some advantages, and they cooperated in order to gain some benefits for their people. We also see that some of the Spanish and Indian families intermarried. They were related outside of marriage, but they became related. And there's this interesting quote from Fray Esteban de Perea from 1631. And so this is still pretty early in New Mexico Spanish history. He says, "In this new land, the people are raised since children in the custom of the Indians." So you can see that with that small group of people, about those 50 families, etc., surrounded by so many Indians, and having Indians living in the Villa de Santa Fe, or people living on their estancias near the pueblos, you see this interaction of folks together, and even that interrelationship, and people creating this new culture in New Mexico between the two. Now, there are some underlying factors, though. It's not simply what you might hear or read or expect when it comes to the Pueblo Indian uprising. A couple other things you have to dig a little bit deeper into. It's not simply us versus them, the Spanish are bad, the Pueblo Indians were abused. It's this other pieces going on, because there were these periods of cooperation, but that began to get frayed, particularly politically, because of some stressors that were going on due to long periods of drought that diminished the crops and food. We had famine that killed livestock and even started to kill some of the people, the Pueblo Indians, as well as some of the Spanish population. This led to increased raids from Navajo, who themselves, through drought, were not having access to food and were raiding the pueblos or the Spanish settlements or the Spanish haciendas. And then there was that strict regimen of Franciscan friars. We do hear testimony from some Pueblo Indians about the fact that the Franciscan friars, they rang their bells every day for people to get to service. They rang their bells every day for people to get to work. And so there was some discontent around that regimen that the Franciscan friars had placed upon the Indians in their daily lives. But there were these two magistrates from La Cañada whose severe actions really lit the match to what was going on here, and unfortunately led to this tragic event. But for the Pueblo Indians, seen as a victory of freedom, from being underneath the Spanish dominion. But this event is critical for this particular presentation because it altered the trajectory of New Mexico Spanish history and its cultural development. This event changed everything. I can only imagine what our history would be if this Pueblo Indian revolt had not happened. The small numbers of people that would have continued to live here, hard to say that there would have been anyone else that would have come. Many of us would not be living here today because we would not have the same ancestors. It would be different ancestors. We would have a whole totally different type of history. So as tragic as this event was, it really did form a trajectory that became what we have experienced and inherited in terms of a Nuevo Mexicano culture. So you all know that the exiled individuals, the Mexican families, left the North with Pito Indian and Southern Tiwa Indian. So not all the Indians were opposed to Spanish governance. And then these folks went down and settled in the El Paso region, and they were spread across several little communities down that way. And again, I just want to emphasize that without the uprising exile, there would have been no great Spanish migration to New Mexico in this time period of 1693 to 1697. So a few things to know about this period of exile. We have families that were then left their homes with really nothing on their backs other than whatever clothes they could carry, and then headed down south to save their lives in two big groups, one from the southern part, Rio Bajo, the others from Santa Fe, and then all joined up down south. There were attempts, but they were failed attempts at restoration of Spanish governance among the Pueblo Indians in 1680 and 1681. And although there were some Pueblo Indians that wanted to welcome back that Spanish governance, it wasn't a strong enough political faction to really make that happen. And so people were content to have to either live in El Paso, and many of them just found it too difficult to live there. So they left. They went down south to Nueva Vizcaya, into those regions of Chihuahua, Parral. Some went to Sonora. There was always a connection between New Mexico and Sonora in trade, and then some even went further south into Nueva Galicia, which is pretty much central Mexico. So we see the disbursement of many families as well as those who chose to stay at El Paso. Now, this is where things begin to change with this man here, Don Diego de Vargas Zapata y Luján, who became governor of New Mexico in 1691. And what a remarkable individual, really, in terms of our history, and particularly when it comes to this great Spanish migration into New Mexico. Because first of all, he had the gumption to think that, yeah, perhaps there's an opportunity here to go back north and see if we could restore Spanish governance in some sort of negotiation with Pueblo Indians. He must have been receiving some sort of indications from Indians that were coming and communicating to people in the South that there might be some, receptive feelings here to welcome back or bring back Spanish governance. But one of the things that's really clear is that he did get authorization from the Viceroy to send a troop of folks, about 50 soldiers with him, to go northward just to check it out and see what could be done. And so he left El Paso around August 16th, around that day, and began to go north, arrives at Santa Fe in September, mid-September of that year. And really just in a matter of a few days, from September 15th to 16th, he's meeting with this leader, Luis Tupatu, who was a leader of the rebellion, of the revolt, and now was the leader of the Tehuas in northern New Mexico, and was really open to having some conversation with Vargas around the potential restoration. They were feeling the pressure of Apaches raiding them. There were disagreements among the leaders in terms of how well they get along or not, because these were all different tribes, Tewa, Tiwa, Quieres, Towa. But Tupatu and the Tewa folks felt there was some sort of need to maybe come back together. And within the space of a couple of days, they came up with an agreement in which the Pueblo Indians would cooperate with Vargas to restore Spanish governance. Now, by the 16th, just a month later, he's writing to the Viceroy about what he saw as a great victory in terms of restoring New Mexico to the Spanish crown, in which he was lauded by the Viceroy for what he had accomplished here with such few men, but mainly with the cooperation of Indians. But his idea was that he wanted 500 families and 100 soldiers to ensure the restoration. That's what his ask was. I'll give you a preview here. He didn't get 500 families, but that's what his vision was, is to bring that. He did get close to the 100 soldiers, but he did not get the 500 families. But this was his original thinking. Now, what's important about this restoration thing, though, is, as I mentioned before, there were people who were related to the Pueblo Indians, but we can't underestimate the fact that some of these leaders were willing to negotiate. They were willing to say, yes, we would like to have back the Spanish governance. We would work with you to support that. Not all the Pueblo leaders agreed, but these are some of the individuals that did. They really deserve recognition in our history for people who wanted to put behind, disagreement and wanted to find a way to live together in peace, find some way to cooperate with each other as they had done previous to the revolt era. And so these are individuals that deserve some recognition for that role. People will recognize the name of José López Naranjo, an Indian who is one of my dad's ancestors, as one of those. His brother was not one who was in agreement and fought and resisted against Spanish governance. But these men were really critical for what was to set the ground for the great Spanish migration to New Mexico. But I do want to give credit again, just so you understand just how closely people were related. You know, people like these soldiers here, these two soldiers here, had relatives among the Pueblo Indians, and Vargas really relied on these men who had relatives to help secure this peace. I can only think and imagine that there were people on both sides who had relatives living in El Paso, those living up in the Pueblo Indian communities who wanted to see each other after 13 years. They wanted to come back together. Take a look at Miguel Luján. He had comadres, he had relatives among the Tewa and Tano, and in fact, he was a brother-in-law to another man here, and he was the uncle to Tupatu's wife. So that's how closely related some of these people were. I do want to point out this one woman who on Facebook, we put some things out there around Josefa de Hinojos, identified as a Coyota, and she was part Zuni Indian. She's the wife of Diego Montoya, and most people Montoyas were descended of this family, but she was the sister of a war captain from Zuni. So here we have this sense that part of this coming together again was the result of relatives wanting to see each other. And just to let you know, again, you might recognize some ancestors on this page as well. These are the kind of people that had relatives among the Indians. So we see the older New Mexico families wanting to come back, and they want to get connected to their relatives. That's one underlying factor to this restoration. And then here's a chart that I have shared online, and I've shared in other presentations. But again, it just shows you just how connected Indian and Spanish families were with each other. But this chart also begins to show some of the integration with some of the new families that were coming into New Mexico. So here's what Vargas writes. He says, and this is his early thinking in 1692. So he's just been successful in securing this restoration agreements, these accords. He says, as to the citizens, your excellency and the royal treasury, you should not harbor any great hopes. It would be easier for the Inquisition to forgive the Jews than force the citizens to leave the places where they live and are well established. Thus, you should sift through the jails of Mexico City, Querétaro, Guadalajara, and Rosario, and send craftsmen here, gunsmiths, carpenters, barbers. Miners, vagrants, and vagabonds in the reales, those are the mines, can come to this land to explore the mines. There are many ores I have seen. The families from El Paso should be considered with regard to security and of better quality, but not in terms of economy. Without corresponding support and assistance from the Royal Treasury, they will be unable to move. So it's very curious because you know Vargas is trying to think through where are we going to find these 500 people, families that I need. He wasn't too discerning here in terms of sifting through the jails to find craftsmen and people that could come up, or vagrants and vagabonds. Now, this did not happen, but this was the original thinking, but this is not quite what turned out. Again, we would have had a different history, I think, if this had been the case, but this did not quite pan out. But notice this last sentence here. He did regard the people from El Paso, the former families of northern New Mexico, to be of better quality. And we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So then a few months later, in January 1693, he's back in El Paso. Vargas is writing to the viceroy, and he's sharing his intent to personally travel to Nueva Vizcaya and Nueva Galicia to recall the former residents of New Mexico. So he has some families at El Paso, but he wants to bring the others back. He wants to make them be part of that 500. So he's going to travel personally out to find these people and bring them back. So he even had made plans about where he would settle these 500 people, how many in Santa Fe, how many in Santo Domingo, how many further south, how many up north. He was already laying out his plans for where people should reside. And of course, he wanted the T1 Lapido Indians to move back into their pueblos of Socorro and Isleta down south. Now, I want to bring your attention to this gentleman here, John B. Culligan, Jack Culligan. A few of you may know him and remember him, but many people today won't recognize his name. But Jack and I became acquainted with each other through written correspondence in the early 90s. Some of you may know about his book, The Juan Páez Hurtado Expedition. He and I co-authored The Spanish Recolonization. These two books were really based on our shared interests. We had and discovered that we were both interested in understanding who were the people that came to New Mexico in 1693, 94, 95. Who were these people? How do we account for who actually arrived here? There's a lot of names on these lists, but how do we know that even came? And so he and I began working together to sort that out. And he's a remarkable researcher. In fact, he was someone who was acquainted with and became acquainted with Rick Hendricks, a former state historian, but also a member of the Vargas Project that worked on that volume of Vargas books with John Kessel. And Jack introduced me to Rick Hendricks, and I began corresponding with Rick. Jack and I both served as research consultants to the Vargas Project. We're both listed as such. I'm listed as a research consultant for the Royal Crown Restored, and Jack is listed as a research consultant for Blood on the Boulders. And then you might know Jack from his work with Rick Hendricks on the New Mexico prenuptial investigations from the Durango Archives, which is 2 volumes and thankfully available in digital format online. But he was on our Mijo on his mother's side, and he and I pulled our research together, and he introduced me to some new records. And we began to think about a large volume. And in fact, we submitted this title to the Vargas Project because we really were going to work on a large book called The Spanish Resettlement of New Mexico, 1694 and 95, an account of the families that came from Nueva España, Nueva Galicia, and Nueva Vizcaya. So we had an idea for, and really a lot of material for a large volume. Unfortunately, it didn't quite pan out that way. And partly because I began to find a lot of new records, searching Mexico City church records on some of the families that came from Mexico City. And in those days, folks, there were no indexes online. I was simply ordering microfilm from churches and going frame by frame by frame, looking for these people, and began to find more information. So this slowed us down just a little bit. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up putting our material into 3 publications. So you see Jack's book on the Juan Páez Hurtado Expedition. It's an outstanding resource. I understand it's out of print, so it's rather expensive. You'll have to request it through interlibrary loan, but it's an excellent book if you have people that came with that expedition, and I'll show you some surnames in a moment. Jack also did this real interesting article that most people totally forgot about, this very small group that Vargas did recruit, and we'll get to those people in just a minute, but that's been published in 2 places. And it's hard to get a hold of, but I might put that into a PDF and make that available on the Beyond Origins of New Mexico Families website, just so people have access to that information. And then, of course, there's the Spanish Recolonization of New Mexico. It's a rather large book with a lot of genealogy as well as some history. It's out of print, difficult to get a hold of, but I'm hoping that when I retire, I'll be able to issue a new edition of that and make it available to people. So we'll see how that goes. But here were the sources. So those of you who see the stuff online now, you get to a website, you have people show you all these names of lineages. What you don't maybe know are the sources, and oftentimes sources are given. But this is what we really spent a lot of time really digging into these records to analyze them, to read them, to understand them, making notes. Jack has a big book that I have a copy of all his notes from all these different sources. I've got all my notebooks with all my notes as well that we use to create our writings. But these are sources hopefully you're familiar with. I think I'm seeing more and more people not familiar with Origins of New Mexico Families. Please, folks, get a copy of this. It's now available again in publication from the Museum of New Mexico Press or through Amazon.com, maybe even, I don't know if it's available on Barnes & Noble, but you can get a digital version of this. It's well worth the $50, please. It's a bit outdated in terms of some things, and that's why we have the Beyond Origins in New Mexico Families website that I run, where we add information to it, but it's still really, it's the hub of our work, is Origins. And then there's the New Mexico Roots Limited, the Summary of Diligencias, which really were hard to access many years ago. Jack Culligan had a set of these. It was really remarkable. And the other sets were in maybe 2 or 3 or 4 libraries. But thank goodness someone digitized those and now available as PDF versions. This is a key piece of our research, was accessing these summaries so that then we could go look at the original records. There's the El Paso census of 1692 to 93. Used to only be available in a photocopy of the original. Now it's been published in the Vargas journals. There's the muster roll of families recruited in Mexico City. That again, there's like 6 or so different muster rolls that were only available in archival format and photocopies, but now have been published in the Vargas journals. And then the muster roll of families recruited in Zacatecas. That muster roll is problematic, but I'll talk to you more about that now. But it also is published in one of the Vargas journals. So really thankful for the Vargas project to be able to put these things into English and make them available for you all for research. Then there's this really interesting document that Jack, as far as I know, is really the first one to really dig into this archive in the Spanish archives in New Mexico on the proceedings against Vargas, with testimonies by individuals that were recruited from the Juan Paisa Palo expedition. This was a critical one for Jack to understand who were the people that actually came and arrived in New Mexico. And this proceedings occurred in 1697 and 98. Then we have the 1697 livestock distribution list, which again, years ago was only available in photocopy form from the original, but has been published in Blood on the Boulders in the Vargas Project. And then we use various documents in the Spanish archives of the 1690s and 1700s to identify people who had arrived in this time period. So this is where the sources are. Any of you can possibly access many of these now in digital or PDF formats. So here it is. It's important to understand, if we're going to understand our culture and our origins, who were the people who settled New Mexico? Who were they? And although we have this tendency to want to go back to 1598 and say that's the beginning, I'm really going to help reshape your mind. No. Let's go to 1693-97. This is the period that things become mixed together quite differently than 1598. And so let's understand who these people were. Where did they come from? And you can see here, there was really one route to get here, folks. You got off the boat in Veracruz or somewhere maybe further south, and you went to Mexico City and you came up the Royal Road, up northward. That was the main route into New Mexico in the 1600s. So who were the groups of settlers that came in this time period? So I'm going to go through each of these individually, but let's give you the overview first. We have the pre-revolt families from El Paso that arrived in Santa Fe in December 1693. Unfortunately, there's no known list of those who arrived. Vargas tells us that he had 70 families, but we have no way yet of determining exactly how many showed up in December 1693. But from 1697, we have an accounting, and I'll give you a number of what we think know with the number of people that were pre-revolt families living in Santa Fe. We had the families recruited by Vargas in Nueva Vizcaya and Nueva Galicia that arrived in Santa Fe in December of 1693 with the pre-revolt families. No known muster roll, but Jack was able to identify these people through other sources. Then we had the families recruited at Mexico City. They arrived here in Santa Fe in June of 1694. And then the families recruited at Zacatecas that arrived in Santa Fe in May of 1695. But let's not forget the soldiers. There were soldiers being recruited to come up here in the north, particularly as Vargas was thinking of his work to restore New Mexico to the crown. And so we have these soldiers from outside New Mexico that come between 1690 and 94. To give you a bit of a sense of this again, just that map here, just going back to the map, these are the regions where many people came from Santa Fe in the north, going all the way down south to Mexico City, even over to Puebla, which I don't see on this map, to the southeast of Mexico City. But there's many communities in here where many of our ancestors came from. And what that means is that our history is not simply New Mexico, Spain. Our history is New Mexico and some other communities that are down south. That's our history. Let's look at this. So of the people who came to New Mexico in this time period, we know that some of them were from New Mexico. But look at all these different communities from Nueva Vizcaya that people identified that they were born in these communities or lived in these communities. Look at these folks from Nueva Galicia and these different areas that they reside in. We even have one person from Nueva León. We have some people from Sinaloa and Sonora. So this is the diversity that we have of the people coming to this region in this short period of time. Look at all these places in Nueva España, which is now central Mexico. Look at all these towns where there's history in these towns. Our families have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 generations in these areas. If you trace to a family that goes back to Puebla, read about the history of Puebla. If you have a family that traces back to Querétaro, read about the history of Querétaro. You have this really deep history there. So again, it's just not New Mexico, Spain. It's New Mexico plus, and then maybe some of these families did come from Spain and settled in these regions. Take a look at the Iberian Peninsula. Yes, there were some people that were natives of Europe or the Iberian Peninsula that did make their way up from Mexico here. Look at the diversity of people from the different regions of Spain, from the north to the south, and even Portugal. And then even one gentleman from the Philippine Islands, a couple of guys, well, actually 3 people from France, and then there was one person, Sebastián Rodriguez, a drummer from Congo, and another one from Guyana. And so when you look at this grouping, so let's start with the first group of people descendant of the pre-revolt families, it's pre-uprising families. There's a combination of people or subgroups within those. We have the descendants of some of the colonists from 1598, those 50 families or so, there's about 30 that left descendant. We have descendants of reinforcements from 1600. We have the families that were established between 1601 and 1680. And then, of course, we have these soldiers that were coming to New Mexico, El Paso between August 1680 and November 1693. Now, jumping just a bit ahead, looking at the 1697 census, we were able to identify 152 pre-revolt families that had resettled New Mexico. So those are the folks that had come back, whose roots were pre-revolt times. But probably no surprise to people now, if you're familiar with some of these families. I'm sure that, like me, I'm descendant of all of these folks, all one of these families, and many of you are too, particularly the Martin Serrano clan, the largest clan of the late 1600s, late 1700s. And what you see here is that of that 152 families, they account for 18 families, or about 12%. The Romero Lucero clan, about 12 families, 7.9%. The Varela family, which were 2 branches, Varela and then the Jaramillo, 8 families. Then there's the Montoya clan and then the Griego clan. And, you know, it's interesting to look at these folks because look at these early families with roots from the 1590s, mestizo, meaning there's mixed with Indians. The Lucero clan related to the Montoyas, which had Mexican Indian antecedents. We're not too clear on the maternal lineages in the Varela family, but the Montoya folks had Indian antecedents, and the Griegos had Indian mixtures as well. So from 1598, here are some of those families that people were descended of that came back. So these folks had those roots back there. But it's a small number. It's not a large number. It's just a small number of folks. Most of us are descendants of these different individuals. The families from 1600, names that will be familiar with you, particularly Vaca, Holguin, Montoya. This family came a little bit a couple years later, but still left descendants, and their descendants returned to New Mexico in 1693. Then look at all these guys, all these individuals that came between, these different years in the 1600 before 1680. But I want to point out, again, look at where they came from. Look at these areas of where they're from. Most of them from somewhere in the Spanish Northern Americas. A few from Spain, one person from Flanders, the Netherlands, 2 people from Portugal, and then some folks from Andalusia. So you can see, again, that mixture of folks coming at different time periods over the 1600s. And then here are a few others. One guy from Asturias, but the rest of these folks mainly from somewhere in Mexico. We have one, that's pretty much some of the roots. So here's what Vargas writes in January 1693. These settlers, and he's referring to the ones from El Paso, originate in and are natives of this kingdom. I shall encourage and furnish them the greatest assistance by taking their wives and children in the wagons. In that kingdom, I shall give them the lands, home sites, and haciendas they had at the time of the uprising of the nations of that kingdom. I shall declare the privileges, honors, and distinctions that as conquerors of His Majesty, the King, our Lord, may God keep him, has conceded and granted them, in addition to their noble status, which they will enjoy as hidalgos, according to the rights and privileges of the kings of Castile. So, although our families at this time period were rather poor, they weren't really rich people, they were honored in terms of that good quality, being people who had lived on the frontier and were being granted that title of hidalgos. Hidalgos did not come with a salary, did not come with great riches, but it came with some social distinctions for folks, particularly when it came to not paying taxes for a period of time, when it came to possibly not being put in jail if you did something illegal, but you would still be held accountable, but you wouldn't be jailed. So they had these privileges, and it's not always clear why people came back. That we don't have a lot of records to say why they wanted to come back. But my sense is that because some people were related, they wanted to connect back with their Indian relatives. Because some folks, felt I was born in this land, I want to come back to the land that my parents had and repopulate that area. There was this longing for people to return. Now, some of the soldiers, some names here you'll be familiar with today, are still around today, individuals with these names. But look at, again, the diversity of the places that these people came from. A sense of these gentlemen really coming out to serve as soldiers to the crown. And a few more. And we see Baal de Aguilar from Lorca in Spain. There's Sebastian Rodriguez from Africa. The Royvals from northern Spain, and then some of the rest of these folks, pretty much all from the New World, where they came from. So between April and July of 1693, Vargas, so that's the first group. We got through the first group. The second group, Vargas left New Mexico and traveled south to personally recruit those residents that had left, and he wanted to bring them back from these communities. They did not want to come back. He was not very successful at this. But he did recruit some other individuals. He was able to get others, but he could not just pry the people loose from where they were now. They did not want to return to northern Mexico. But he did come back, and with the families that he did recruit, he sent them on to the Pueblo Socorro because he didn't want them mixing with the old families because they had better quality than the new recruits. So he says, thus I'm leaving Durango, very unhappy to see that it's been made impossible to accept the settlers and other people who may offer to go to the Kingdom of Mexico, as well as the refugee settlers who have been living in the Kingdom of Nueva Vizcaya and various outposts. He was not able to recruit a lot of people. It was a small group of people that he managed to recruit and bring north with him to El Paso. So here's what it looked like. So first of all, he was writing to the Viceroy in June 1693. He mentioned that he had managed to recruit 100 soldiers. Doesn't mean that they were on their way to New Mexico, but he was recruiting soldiers. And he says he had 50 settlers, mainly from these towns. So it's Zacatecas, Sombrerete, Durango, consisting of 14 families and 14 young single men and one single woman who served as a cook. An Indian woman serves as a cook. What we're able to account for, though, is 46 individuals in terms of their racial status. And so you can see that there was 9 adults were Españoles, but then we have mulatos, negros, moriscos, mestizos, coyotes, and the Tarascan Indian. But here's what's remarkable. The widowed women headed 9 families, and children consisting of approximately 32 people. So out of those, whatever number we have come up with here, it's really remarkable that these widowed women were willing to come to New Mexico and settle. They consisted of the majority, the 59% of the colonizing group, and there were only 3 married couples, 2 with children, totaling 8 people. So Vargas was really just trying to pull people away from where they were living. Maybe they saw some advantage to coming to the north, as dangerous as it was to live there, but they were willing to come with him to the north to seek something different for themselves. And particularly these widowed women. I think there's a story to be told there about more stories about women in our past, and this would certainly be something to dig into about who were these women and why did they do what they did. But here's some of the surnames from this group that have survived and people who have descendants from this group. So the Betas, the Benavides, the Crespins, the Fernandez, Valerio, Rendon. This Romero Cruz, this is Francisco Javier Romero, who left many descendants in Santa Cruz, the Saiz family, and a couple of Velasco individuals. All right, so that group comes up and is part of the El Paso citizens that the Vargas brings into Santa Fe in December 1693. So we have two groups already starting to settle in Santa Fe. So the next group, so as soon as Vargas, his news has reached the viceroy, there's jubilation in the city of Mexico. Word is going out that New Mexico has been restored to the Spanish ground. And already people are thinking, how do we help recruit people? And so in March and September, a couple of individuals from New Mexico, Captain Cristobal de Velasco and Fray Francisco Farran, are in Mexico City to help with the recruitment process between the months of March and September 1693. By May of that year, they've got 20 families and 70 individuals. A couple of more months go by, and by September, there's now 68 families with 235 individuals. Now, what's interesting about this family group, well, first of all, is they traveled a long distance. When you hear stories of pioneers, and particularly those of us, in North America here in the United States, we hear these stories of pioneers from the east to the west. People go west, moving on the wagons, and you've seen all these movies and things about people in wagons traveling through dangerous territory, inhabited by hostile Indians, and they're moving through and getting all the way to California or anywhere in the West. Folks, we had our pioneers too, from Mexico City to Santa Fe, 1,500 miles. Now, it wasn't expected to take so long, but it was 283 days on the road. It's quite a long distance, and yes, people did die along the way, but they managed to enter Santa Fe in June of 1694. Interesting about this group, most of them all Españoles, probably one or two were mixed, but there were tailors, weavers, brick masons, stone masons, blacksmiths, cartwrights, painters, carpenters, filigree artisans, a coppersmith, a miller, and a metal assayer. This was a group of tradespeople. These were not people of the upper elite class. They were not people of the lower class. These were really good middle class tradespeople who had skills that could help with this restoration in northern New Mexico. It was required that the individuals in this group must be married. They did not want to allow single men. So this is a very different group than what Vargas had recruited, where there were a lot of single people. In this group, they were looking for married couples with children. There were a couple of single men allowed to come, like the Frenchmen, Juan Archiveque and Santiago Grole, were allowed to come only because they were being exiled in a way. They were being forced to come to the northern frontier. Other than that, all the families were married. What we can account for in terms of arrival out of the 235 was 217 individuals, 62 families, 4 single men. There were 129 adults, 88 children. Now imagine traveling 1,500 miles in wagons. What was supposed to be a 3-month journey turns into a 9-month sojourn that you have to feed and repair wagons, and women giving birth. There were about 8 women that were pregnant and giving birth along the way. And having to do this with 88 children in your care under the age of 15. Wow, it's just a remarkable story. 93, almost 93%, well, 92.3% were people with origins in the northern Spanish Americas. And then the majority of those people were from Nueva España, mostly Mexico City and Puebla. But interestingly, what we did learn about this is that there were 9 distinct kinship groups. So the research I did into the genealogy, and Jack had really done some really good work with identifying the people from the records that had arrived. I did the work on the Mexico City records, and we were able to identify 9 distinct kinship groups for 116 people. 28 of these 62 families were related. And out of the 217 people, 116 of them were all part of some kinship group, 9 kinship groups. It's really an interesting group of folks. I can only imagine that as they were thinking about whether to leave Mexico City or not, that people were signing up and then convincing their relatives to come with them and say, hey, let's all go together. So people weren't coming up here totally isolated in some cases. So here are the names, folks. If it was not for this period of time, we would not have these names in New Mexico. If it was not for this great Spanish migration, we wouldn't have these folks here. But again, take a look at their origins, and I'm sure hopefully you find your surname or relatives that you're related to in your genealogy. I have quite a few here myself. I have the Bustos, I have the Gurale surname, I have the Giron de Tejeda and Marquez de Ayala in my ancestry. I have the Moreno de Trujillo in my ancestry. I have the Quintana in my ancestry. I have the Silva in my ancestry, and the Valdez in my ancestry, and the Vega y Coca in my ancestry. And take a look at where these folks came from. Okay. So Vargas then, still wanting more people. He wants to get to that 500, but he's not near that 500. He maybe got, close to 300, maybe not quite the 500. So he's still trying to get more people to come. So he assigns Captain Juan Paez Hurtado to recruit families of quality, good character, and social standing in Nueva Vizcaya and Nueva Galicia. And this occurs in the period of June 1694 to 1695. So right after the families arrived from Mexico City, he's still trying to bolster and get more people up to the north. Now, the curious thing is he had a hard time. Juan Paez Hurtado had a hard time recruiting people, particularly with the finances, because when he got to Parral, there was no money in the World Treasury to help him do the recruitment. And he went further south to Zacatecas and still having trouble getting funding to do this. So there is a list that's been published that shows a muster roll, but that list is fraudulent, and it has 46 families and 145 individuals, and it's a fraudulent list because what Paez Hurtado was doing in order to support people on the trip, he was inventing families. He was splitting families up to create new families to get the money from the treasury, and then he would either pay the people a small amount and they would not come to New Mexico, or he had split up families into multiple families and then just paid the families for being one family instead of three families. So Jack Culligan did a really good job of finding and detailing this fraud. And of course, Paez Hurtado was called on the carpet for this in inquiries because people knew that he had created fraud and they wanted to know where the money went to. So actually, rather than 46 families arriving, there were only 25 and 29 heads of household. So there were married couples here. There were 90 children and 16 individual men and 5 single women that arrived in Santa Fe, about 150 people. So again, we're not quite up to, we're having more than 300 now, but not almost getting close to 500, but not quite. And this family, combination of Españoles, Mestizos, and Novatos. And their geographic origins, not surprising because they were recruited Zacatecas. The majority of them were from Nueva Galicia, so Valete and Zacatecas. A few from Nueva España, and even smaller numbers from these other places, including Portugal and Spain. And here are some of their names. Again, familiar names in New Mexico. Without these families having been recruited, even through a fraudulent process, we would not have people in New Mexico with these family names. Many of you would not be here today because some of these folks are your ancestors as well. So I'm sure you're familiar with some of these names that still survive today in New Mexico. Now, this was a critical document, the May 1697 census. This is a copy from one of the pages. So this is the pages that Jack had sent me. He had a copy of this, and he sent me all the pages of this as well. And I transcribed these into a notebook. And I started marking, once we could identify, well, where were these people from? Were they the pre-revolt family? Were they a Mexico City family? Were they a Vargas recruit? Were they a soldier? Where were they from? And we did our own accounting, double-checked the math on this, and came up with our own document that we used to understand who the people were. So by May 1697, there were no longer really any groups of people coming into New Mexico. These were the settlers that were being given assistance. They were being given livestock. They were being given materials for clothing. And this really shows us this new start of Nuevo Mexicano culture. This is the time period where we're starting to see this change and creation of a pastoral society with all the livestock people were given, the farming utensil tools, the seeds to farm. This is where it really starts. It really wasn't that indelible yet in the pre-revolt, because most of the people in the pre-revolt, they wanted to be encomenderos. They weren't always the farmers. There was some livestock going on. But here, with all of these families, they have to sustain themselves. And Vargas wanted them to do that by giving them land so they would farm, they would raise sheep, they would raise cattle, They raise goats, whatever they can do. So our Nuevo Mexicano pastoral society starts here. And so over the next century and even the 1800s, we have corridos, we have stories, we have things that are all related kind of to that pastoral existence. And we even see in the 1700s this great economic boom when it comes to wool and weaving, the weaving traditions and the wool that was transported down south. And then the other part of this too is that this is where we begin to see the land grant tradition starts here. It doesn't start in 1598. Our Nuevo Mexicano land grant tradition begins in this time period because this is where Vargas is giving people those land grants, where people have land that they can then pass on. They can use it for farming and livestock, and then they can pass that on, whether those are family land grants or individual land grants, or whether they were community-based land grants. This is the start of that era at this period, with all this mingling of people from different places. So in our analysis, we were able to identify 314 households. There were 317 on the list, but there are 3 duplicates. So we got rid of the duplicates. We were able to account for 955 individuals. Now that 314 households, you can see that's short of the 500 we Vargas wanted, but that's what we account for. Entries number 1 through number 238 are family units. Entries number 239 to 317 are single individuals. But it's really clear, it's really interesting that we can find and see these 4 distinct groupings in the census. So again, if you know what you're looking for, and you read through the list, and even in the margins, it's listed that these are the families from, but we were able to account for the families here from these different areas, these distinct groupings of people who had settled. The soldiers aren't listed in this one, so they're missing. In our analysis, and this really comes from my analysis actually, the pre-revolt families, there were 48.4% of these 314 families were from pre-revolt times. They were the majority of the families that came back, the strength of them. Mexico City recruits were about 16.9%. The País Hurtado group about 7%, and the Vargas recruits a small number of 2.8%, and then the single individuals about 24.9%. So, you know, I just want to share a few other examples. That gives you a sense, that 1697 census gives us a sense of who was there. This was a period where even when you look at marriages, you can still see that in this time period of 1697 to about 1715 or 1710, you'll still see that pre-revolt families tend to want to marry with other pre-revolt families. Mexico City families tend to want to marry with Mexico City families. But in some cases, you're starting to see people branch out. You're starting to see some of the pre-revolt families marry with the Mexico City families, or some of the Mexico City families marrying with the País Hurtado families. But it's slow going. It's really slow going. These groups sort of stick to themselves in terms of what's happening. But really, I would say between that 1610, 1620, maybe 1705, sorry, 1705, 1720, we begin to see this integration of families that become there. And just imagine, you know, if you're a child who has a mother from New Mexico with old roots in New Mexico, but you have a father from Mexico City, and they're telling you stories from their cultural upbringing, what does that do when it mixes together? You know, what do you learn from folks? You know, what if your father is directly from Spain and your mother is from Zacatecas? What is it that you're going to inherit from them in terms of customs, in terms of language, how you say something, the way you speak, the dialect, the colloquialisms that you use in Mexico City versus up in northern New Mexico, or in Zacatecas versus Puebla? You get this interesting intermingling of people that starts to create this unique Nuevo Mexicano culture that evolves in the 1700s. And again, back to my main point, don't think New Mexico, 1598, New Mexico, Spain. Be thinking this time period of 1693 to 97 as this place where people come together from so many different backgrounds and begin to integrate with each other, and the influences coming from so many different places. Because the cultural expressions, even though they were Spanish citizens, the cultural expressions vary from region to region. If you've ever traveled down to Mexico, you'll see the differences from region to region in the way they prepare their food, the type of food they like to eat, the customs, even how they worship, the songs that they sing. All these things come together in a different way to shape Nuevo Mexicano culture, starting our land grant traditions, our sequia traditions, our ways of celebrating religious customs, all start to be shaped up in the 1700s. Not so much from the 1600s, but from the 1700s. Here's an example I want to share with you of this mingling. So this is something I've written about in an article about one of the Dominguez, this Coyota individual who had roots, some Indian roots in Taos, but also Spanish parents. And then Domingo Lujan, a mestizo who had a brother from Cochiti. And so you have these individuals that were Spanish and Indian in the 1600s. Juana was captured during the Puebloan Revolt and was taken up to Taos, where I believe she stayed with her relatives. Domingo was away and he moved down south, and they were separated until they were joined back together again when Vargas came back. Unfortunately, he died on that route soon after. In the second year, he died in 1693. He was thrown by his horse. But look at his children here. So this one daughter marries into the Mexico City family. She's a Coyota, so we have the Union. And then look at the next generation too, where you see still a little bit of combination of marriages with the Mexico City family, the Burale thing here, the Mexico City family, Garcia Dorado, but then the old Montoya family from New Mexico. So we're starting to see in the next generations this mingling of people from different backgrounds together to form their own unique families. Another value to doing the genealogy work, this is some research I did on the ancestry of Gregoria Ruiz. Once I started looking at the Mexico City records or others records, etc., I was able to find a marriage record that named her parents. I was able to find information on her parents and grandparents, and it just kept me going back and back and back. What I want to illustrate here is Gregoria Ruiz and Antonio Silva came from Mexico City in 1694, arrived in New Mexico. They were progenitors of the Silva family. But I want you to look at this count of generations for Gregoria. She has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations before you get back to Spain. 5 generations of history. What is that history? Well, I've been doing research on this. Some of this has been published. I've been doing a lot more history research on this family in terms of their land and where they lived and what they did. And that hasn't been published yet, but I will get to it eventually. But this is one of the other points I want to make is that think about all this lengthy history we have here in these roots and look at how many generations we have to go back before we get to Spain. This was one of our first identified conquistadores in our ancestry, was Alonso Sotero, verified as a conquistador. We have very few of these, but I would imagine the more research we do with Mexico City families, we're going to come across more descendants of conquistadores. Here's another example of somebody, Maria de los Reyes Leva y Mendoza, had children and married Diego Giron, but had children in an illicit affair with Francisco Afán de Rivera. And you can see here that she already has several generations. This is research that Rob Martinez and I have done in terms of Mexico. So we're still trying to get this family and her lineage back into Spain, but several generations in Mexico City. But again, take a look at her children here. We have one marrying Antonio Romero from the Romero family, old family, another one marrying the Alpandacas from the 1600s, the Cisneros from the 1600s. Then you have someone marrying the Montes Vigil from the Zacatecas groups of 1695. So you see this blending again of people. And Francisco Afán himself arrived later too in that period of 1693 to 95 as well. And I'm going to conclude here with a chart that I've shared in another presentation as an illustration of this development of Hispano culture, just to again impress upon you on the far side here, you'll see the names of the different locations where people had come from and what families, maybe contributed to this and what their Costa background was. And you can see that all these individuals and their cultural upbringing and what they're bringing to them in that 1693, 1700 period, that restoration and adaptation, it's a formative era of our culture. And then it gets more integrated and stable in the 1701 to 1720 period. And what comes out of it is our Nuevo Mexicano culture, the way that we speak Spanish. Don't people think, oh, we speak this way because, or Spanish this way because it goes way back to 1598. No. We have so many different other influences in our language. And then it influenced our art, music, and poetry, the folklore, tales, and legends, that pastoral livelihood, trade skills, the textiles, even the medicine and remedios, We have that preservation of honor that was so important in those years of the 17 and early 1800s. All the rituals, customs, traditions, the alabados, the spiritual expressions, the expressions of our faith. And then we can't forget the Native American influences as well. And what I have to add to this in terms of Native American influences is in the 1700s is the Genízaro. And I'm really pleased to be part of a project on the Native Bound, Unbound project, where I'm identifying, for many years, I've collected names of Genízaro families. They deserve to be recognized as founding families of New Mexico. And I have a long list of these families that at some point I'd love to do a presentation on this, as well as I'll be writing about them, because they need to be recognized as contributing to our Middle Mekong culture as well, by the fact that they established families and left descendants and in New Mexico. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I really want to thank you all for your attention today, and certainly through Facebook, other places, if you have questions or comments that you want to leave for me, please do. I really greatly appreciate hearing from you. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll see where we want to go from there.